The Arizona sun has a way of leaning on a man's back until his bones feel like iron rods bent under its weight. That morning, I rode slow across the red dirt stretch, my horse's breath coming heavy, each hoofprint sinking darker into the ground with sweat. I didn't rush him. I never do. Some men think speed means strength, but I've learned the long way that steady keeps you alive. Tied tight behind my saddle was a half-dead outlaw, wrists bound, head lolling with each lurch of the trail. 6 days of tracking, 2 more of dragging him back alive, and I was just about ready to see the dust of Broken Mesa rise in front of me. He'd been hiding in the foothills west of Apache Gorge, stealing stock, taking shots at ranchers, then slipping away into stone like smoke. I stayed on him through nights without sleep, waiting for him to drop his guard. When I finally caught him, it wasn't clean. He was a big man, wild with fever, strong enough to fight even while half delirious, but I roped him down and brought him in alive. That was the deal. Alive, paid in full. As the town drew near, the landmarks came back the way old scars do. McCready's blacksmith shed still leaned empty, the church steeple still tilted like it was bowing to the desert, and the trough outside Calhoun's saloon lay dry, same as it had the day I first rode in with a badge fresh pinned to my chest. I don't wear it on the outside anymore. Badge sits inside my coat now, out of sight, but I still feel its weight. I'm not from Broken Mesa, never belonged to it. I was born near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, second son of a farmer and a quiet woman who died too early, leaving a hole in the family no one ever patched. The war pulled me young and spit me out older than I should have been. When I pinned on that badge afterward, I thought it fixed something inside me. It didn't. After the mess at Agua Fria, after what I did there, I hung the badge up and disappeared for near half a decade. But when Broken Mesa called again, sending a boy shot through the gut and bleeding out, I figured I owed something to somebody. Maybe not to the council, not to the town, but to the land and the people who had no one else standing for them. So I came back. This bounty was supposed to be simple. Bring the man in, get paid, stay quiet. That was all I had in mind. I dismounted slow at the town hall, the outlaw's shallow breath still rattling behind me. Councilman Pritchard waited at the steps with 2 clean-cut traders, men with polished boots who'd never blistered a hand on a shovel or broke a horse in their life. They smiled too wide, talked too loud, men who thought silver shined brighter than sweat. "You got him," Pritchard said, stepping forward, eyes already measuring what this catch might be worth. "Didn't think you'd make it back alive, not with the way that one shoots." I didn't bother answering, just pulled the key from my belt and dropped it in his hand. "He's alive," I said. Flat. That was the condition. Alive, paid full. Pritchard smirked and gave a nod to the traders like he'd just won himself a game. "That he is," he said, "and you'll be glad to know the council decided to reward you with more than silver." He stepped aside, and that's when the door opened. 2 young women stepped out, barefoot, wrists bound in thick hemp rope. Their dresses were thin, stained from travel, their long black hair hanging unbrushed over faces that didn't flinch, didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. They stood still, like carved stone. "They're twins," Pritchard said, as though that detail sweetened the filth of what he was offering. "Taken off a trader's caravan near the border. Nobody claimed them. We figured you might want something for the cabin. Company, help, whatever suits you." My jaw tightened. I didn't move. Pritchard's voice picked up faster, sensing my silence like it was slipping through his fingers. "They're no use to us, and if we let them loose, they'll either die or go back to raiding. But in your hands, well, it's a mercy, Sheriff, and a fair trade." My hand went to the hunting knife on my hip, and Pritchard stiffened like he thought I'd cut him down right there. I stepped forward, though not at him. The nearest woman tensed, the smallest flinch, but didn't move as I lifted the knife. With one quick stroke, I cut the rope binding her wrists. Then I did the same for her sister. The rope dropped in a heap between their feet. I handed the knife back to Pritchard without a word. Then I turned, walked down the steps, and mounted my horse. "Wait a second." Pritchard called after me, but I didn't stop. I rode straight down Main Street, the outlaw still tied behind me, the heat pressing down like judgment. At first, the women didn't follow. They stood still in the dust, unbound but unmoving. I didn't look back, didn't expect them to. But by the time I reached the ridge outside town, I heard the faint rhythm of footsteps trailing behind me. Not hurried, not begging, just steady. They weren't walking toward shelter or safety. They were following me. I didn't know what it meant. Didn't ask. Didn't welcome it either. But the truth is, when I saw them standing at my fence line that evening, quiet and waiting, something in me shifted. I didn't bring them home, but they had come anyway. That was the beginning. And before I take you deeper into this story, I want to pause here and ask you something. If you're listening to me now, if these words find you, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and follow this channel. Tell me where you're watching from. I've carried this story a long way through dust and silence, but stories only live when they're shared. The first night, I didn't invite them in. I didn't even speak to them. After I unsaddled my horse and shut the cabin door, I thought that would be the end of it. But when morning came, I opened the door and found them still there, huddled near the barn wall under an old saddle blanket they must have pulled from a broken crate. They hadn't run, hadn't tried to slip away in the dark. They were sitting quiet, as if the dirt itself had claimed them, eyes watching the ground instead of me. I stood there with my coffee mug, steam curling up into the cool dawn, and I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't a rescuer. I wasn't anybody's answer. I figured when I cut their ropes, they'd scatter like birds freed from a snare, but they didn't. I set a plate of beans on the porch step without a word and went back inside. When I checked again an hour later, it was gone. Not a crumb left. I didn't see them take it, but I knew they had. That small truth sat heavy on me. The days that followed moved in the same rhythm. I'd leave food on the porch, sometimes just jerky or cornbread if that's all I had, sometimes stew if I'd made enough. I didn't call them, didn't look at them when I set it down. And still, every time, the plate was taken, washed, and left by the rail, as if to say, "We heard you." It wasn't much, but it was enough to start something I hadn't planned for. I could hear them at night. The barn was close enough that the shuffle of hay, the scrape of crates, and the shifting of blankets reached my window. No voices, though. Not once. Just movement, like shadows rearranging themselves. It was strange to know people were there but never hear them speak. It made me uneasy at first, like I was being haunted by something half alive. But each morning, when I stepped out with my coffee, there they were again, sitting quiet, waiting for the day. I told myself it wasn't my concern. They'd leave when they were ready. I'd cut their ropes, and that was all I owed. But truth has a way of digging under a man's skin, and the truth was, I kept making more food than I needed. I brewed extra coffee. I found myself glancing toward the barn more often than I'd admit. On the second morning, I noticed the eggs by the pump, laid out neat on a worn cloth. I hadn't gathered them, but there they were. Naya must have done it, though I didn't know her name yet. On the third morning, one of my shirts showed up folded on the porch rail, the seam I'd torn weeks before, stitched tighter than I'd ever managed with my clumsy hands. Aloe's work, I'd learn later. They didn't ask, didn't announce, just gave back in their own way, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, like maybe silence wasn't empty, maybe it was an exchange if you knew how to listen. Still, I kept my distance. When I went to chop wood behind the cabin, I could feel Aloe's eyes on me from the barn, watching, measuring. She didn't look away when I caught her once. There was no fear in her gaze, but no trust either. Just a steady question she wasn't speaking. I understood it. A woman doesn't look at a man like that unless the world has taught her reasons to be cautious. I didn't blame her. I just let her look and went back to my work. Nia was different. She drifted toward the animals, brushing down my mule, feeding scraps to the hens, even coaxing the old dog to sit near her. He'd never taken to anyone but me, but with her, he lay at her feet like he'd been waiting all his life. That told me more than words could have. Animals don't lie. They know who carries harm and who doesn't. At night, when I sat by the hearth with my boots off and my shirt drying by the fire, I thought about them, out there in the barn. the rain tapping the roof, the cold seeping in, and two young women lying in the straw with nothing but a blanket between them and the dark. I wanted to tell myself it wasn't my problem, but every time I tried, my chest tightened. Not pity, just that old weight I carried, the one that told me if I could have done more in the past, maybe the world would have been different. I didn't speak to them for 3 days, not a word, and they didn't speak to me. But I realized silence can hold meaning. Each time the plate came back clean, each time the eggs were left by the pump, each time my tools ended up sharper than I'd left them, I felt it. They were saying, "We're here. We're trying." And I found myself answering in my own way, leaving more food, brewing stronger coffee, stacking wood where they could reach it for the stove in the barn. That first stretch of days wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet as breath, but it was the kind of quiet that seeps into a man, the kind that makes him wonder if maybe he isn't as alone as he thought. And though I didn't admit it then, not even to myself, I'd already started setting out 3 mugs in the morning instead of 1. It didn't happen all at once, but I started noticing the small things. Life doesn't turn with a loud crack most times. It shifts like a hinge, quiet, almost hidden, until one day you realize the door's already swung open. That's how it was with the twins, Aloe and Nia. I didn't know their names at first, not until I saw them scrawled on that piece of paper Pritchard handed me, but the names fit them in ways I didn't expect. Aloe carried herself like her very skin was armor, steady, sharp, unflinching. Nia was softer in her movements, but not in the way of weakness, more like the way water is soft, shaping everything it touches. Every morning, they were still there. At first, they sat near the barn with their knees drawn up, faces turned down, moving only when I set something on the porch. But then, the quiet changed. On the second morning, I found eggs laid out neatly on a cloth by the pump. I hadn't gathered them. Nia must have. She didn't say a word, but it was her way of answering back. A day later, one of my shirts appeared on the porch rail, clean and mended. I hadn't left it there, hadn't asked, but Aloe's stitches were tight and strong, better than I could ever do myself. She didn't tell me it was her work, but I knew. I caught Aloe watching me sometimes when I worked, splitting wood, sharpening tools, leading the mule in from pasture. She didn't avert her eyes when I noticed. There was no shame in it, no soft flutter, just steady eyes, measuring. Not suspicion exactly, but something close. I let her watch. I knew that look too well. It was the same one I'd given men during the war, the same one I gave strangers on the trail. A look that said, "I need to know what kind of man you are before I trust the ground beneath your feet." I didn't take offense. I figured it meant she wasn't ready to turn her back on me yet. Truth is, I respected it. Nia spent her hours with the animals. The chickens clucked around her ankles like she'd raised them herself. The mule leaned his head against her shoulder as she brushed him down, and the old dog, who'd never given a stranger a kind eye, curled himself at her feet like he'd been waiting for her all along. I remember standing at the porch rail one afternoon, coffee in hand, watching her crouched near the coop, humming something so low I could barely hear it. The hens leaned into her hands like she was part of their flock. There was something in that sight that caught at me, something quiet and aching. It had been years since I'd seen anyone handle living things with such care. I didn't ask them to help. I didn't order, didn't instruct. But the rhythm of the place shifted all the same. The tools I left scattered came back to their hooks. The coop was cleaner than I'd ever kept it. The mule's coat gleamed in the morning light. They moved through my land without asking, as if the place itself had given them permission. At first I told myself it was just survival. They needed food, shelter, something to keep their hands busy. But after a while, I stopped lying to myself. They weren't just surviving. They were choosing to leave their mark on this place. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Ease. A man who's spent as much time alone as I have gets used to silence, but he also learns the weight of it. Silence can press on you, fill your cabin until it feels more coffin than shelter. But the silence around them was different. When Aloe patched a quilt, or when Nia hummed over the chickens, the quiet felt lighter, less like a burden and more like a blanket. For the first time in years, I didn't mind coming back from the fence line and knowing someone else's footprints were fresh in the dirt. One evening, I was stacking wood behind the cabin when Aloe came around the corner carrying a shirt she'd mended. She held it out, not with softness, but like it was a transaction. I took it, turned it in my hands, saw the tight seams. I nodded once. "Thank you." Her eyes stayed on mine longer than I expected. Not warm, not cold, just steady. Then she gave the smallest nod and turned back toward the barn. That small exchange rattled around inside me for the rest of the night. I sat longer than usual on the porch that evening, listening to the faint scrape of movement from the barn. I thought back to that moment in town, Pritchard's smirk, the way he spoke about them like they were a prize to be handed over with a handshake. My jaw tightened remembering it. That rope falling at their feet was supposed to be the end of it, but it wasn't. They'd followed me, and now, with every egg laid on the pump, every stitch mended, every quiet gaze, they were weaving themselves into this land, into me, whether I had words for it or not. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if they'd stay another week or walk off at dawn. But what I knew was this. The cabin no longer felt hollow when the door shut at night. The mornings no longer felt like just my own. Something was changing, slow and quiet, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to fight it. The rain came late, carried in on a low wind that smelled of wet earth and dust pressed down. I sat by the hearth that night, boots off, my shirt hung near the fire to dry. The roof tapped steady with the storm, and I thought maybe it would wash the heaviness off the land for a spell. But I couldn't shake a feeling, one of those old soldier's instincts that crawl up your spine when something isn't right. I tried to ignore it, tried to let the fire and the rain pull me towards sleep, but the silence in the barn pressed too thick. It wasn't the quiet of rest, it was the quiet of something gone wrong. I pulled my coat on and stepped out into the night. The rain caught me in the face, cold and slick. The barn door stood cracked open, light leaking faint from a lantern inside. I pushed it wide, and the smell hit me first. Damp straw, sweat, and the sharp, sour edge of fever. Aloe sat upright in the straw, her back against a post, her arm tight around Nia, who lay trembling beneath a blanket. Even from the doorway I could see the sheen on Nia's forehead, the way her breath came fast and shallow, her body shaking though the air was warm. Aloe looked up at me. Her eyes weren't startled, but they carried a tightness that struck me deep. Not fear, not anger, just the raw panic of someone watching the only thing they love slip away inch by inch. She didn't speak, not at first. She didn't have to. I'd seen enough fever in army tents to know what I was looking at. I crouched low, not too close, and said, "She's sick." Aloe gave one short nod, her jaw clenched, her hand steady against her sister's brow. I didn't waste words. I turned back through the rain to the cabin, grabbed a basin, rags, and the last of the willow tincture I'd kept since winter. My hands moved faster than my thoughts. I wasn't a doctor, but I'd carried too many boys through fevers not to know what to do. When I came back, I set the things down beside them and lowered myself against the opposite wall. Aloe's eyes stayed on me, sharp and searching, but she didn't stop me when I dipped a rag in the water and laid it across Nia's forehead. Hours passed that way. The rain outside rose and fell, tapping the roof like fingers drumming a warning. The fever burned through her, and when the cloth warmed, I changed it. When she stirred and moaned, I steadied her with a hand and gave her sips of water between her lips. Aloe didn't let go of her sister, not once, but I saw the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion dragging at her shoulders. She was fighting panic by sheer will, and though she didn't ask me for help, she didn't push it away either. Nia's breath rattled soft in the dark, and it pulled something raw out of me. I remembered boys no older than her, lying in canvas tents with fever climbing their skin, remembered wives cradling husbands on blood-wet floors after raids, remembered the kind of helplessness that hollows you out. I thought I'd left that behind when I walked away from Agua Fria, but sitting there in that barn, I realized it had never left me. It had just been waiting. At some point in the night, Nia stopped shivering. Her breathing evened, no longer scraping shallow at her chest, but rising fuller, steadier. The color hadn't come back to her cheeks yet, but the worst of the fire seemed to pass. Aloe leaned her head back against the post, her eyelids heavy, but she didn't let herself drift. I could see it in her, the refusal to surrender, even to exhaustion. That grit struck me as hard as anything. I didn't say a word, just sat there in the straw, the lantern light catching on the damp boards, and listened to the sound of her sister breathing easier. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time didn't count the same with the rain and the fever both pressing in, but I remember the moment Aloe's eyes finally met mine without that barrier of suspicion. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just looked at me, tired and raw, and in that silence, something settled between us. Not trust, not yet, but an understanding. We were both holding the same line that night. When the rain led up toward dawn, I stepped outside and drew a long breath. The air was heavy, thick with that smell of a storm passing, the kind that clings to you. I rolled up my sleeves and stood there a while, letting the coolness cut through me. Inside, Naya slept deeper. Aloe sat still, her hand resting light on her sister's arm, her own head finally leaning against the wood. They were still breathing. That counted for more than anything else. I hadn't planned for any of this. I'd told myself I was a man who'd live alone until the land swallowed him. But that night, sitting in a barn with two women who weren't supposed to be mine, who weren't supposed to stay, I realized life doesn't ask permission before it changes you. Sometimes it just happens, one breath at a time, one fever broken in the dark. After Nia's fever broke, the land seemed to breathe easier, and so did I. The rain passed, leaving the ground damp and the air sharp with the smell of wet dust. I stepped out one morning expecting to see them huddled by the barn wall as always, but instead, I found the door open wide and the space inside changed. Where I once kept crates stacked in no order and hay scattered, they'd cleared a corner, swept it clean, and made a cot from boards and blankets. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. They hadn't asked if they could, hadn't waited for permission, and I didn't stop them. Truth is, I stood in the doorway a while, watching, and something in me felt steadier, knowing they'd carved out a place to belong. Aloe moved through that barn like she'd already decided it was home. She brushed down the mule each morning, kept the tack neat, patched places in the roof where the rain had slipped through. I'd walk past and see her shoulders straight, her hands steady, not working like a servant or someone trying to pay off a debt, but like the barn itself deserved tending. She never asked me for tools. She just found them, used them, and left them sharper or cleaner than before. I'd always guarded my routines, not wanting anyone near them, but I realized I didn't mind her touch on the things I owned. Nia, still pale but stronger, spent her days nearer the cabin. I'd find her near the chickens, humming soft as she scattered feed, or bent by the pump with her shawl slipping down her shoulders. The dog followed her like a shadow, the same dog that used to growl at strangers. I remember once she crouched to set water out for him, and when she stood, her eyes caught mine. She didn't look away, didn't hide the tiredness in her face, but there was something else there, something unbroken. I carried that look with me the rest of the day, like a stone in my pocket. The rhythm of the land shifted, not with noise or talk, but with presence. Every tool I reached for was where it should be. The coop stayed clean. The barn smelled less of mildew and more of fresh straw. My boots, which I'd kick off by the door, started showing up neatly set against the wall. No one said a word about it, but those small things spoke louder than anything else could have. They weren't drifting through this place as shadows. They were shaping it, and me along with it. One afternoon, I came back from checking the western fence and found Aloe sitting on the porch rail, sewing by the light. She didn't rise, didn't shrink back like some might. She just kept her needle moving, eyes on her work. I paused at the steps, unsure whether to speak, but she broke the silence first. "The hem was tearing," she said, holding up one of my shirts. Her voice was low even, without apology. I nodded. "Appreciate it." She didn't look at me, but I noticed her shoulders ease, the smallest sign that my words mattered. That night, When I lay awake listening to the coyotes yip across the ridge, I found myself thinking less of the past and more of the steady click of her needle. The strangest part was how natural it all felt, as if they'd been here longer than a handful of weeks. I'd catch myself setting 3 plates at the table, though they still hadn't stepped inside for a meal. I left extra coffee on the porch rail each morning, and by the time I came back from chores, the mugs would be empty, rinsed, left in a neat row. I never heard them laugh, not then, but there was a lightness to the air that hadn't been there before, the kind that made a man's chest hurt less when he breathed. It hit me one evening, splitting wood behind the shed, that I was no longer waiting for them to leave. At first, I told myself they'd stay a few days, maybe a week, then be gone. But every egg gathered, every shirt mended, every quiet step across my land said otherwise. They weren't asking to be tolerated. They were deciding, in their own quiet way, that this was where they belonged. I thought back to Agua Fria, to the killing, to the badge heavy on my chest. I'd carried those ghosts here, expecting the silence to be punishment enough for what I'd done. But the silence had never eased me. It had only carved me out hollow. Now, with them moving through my days, the silence carried something else, like maybe the land was filling in again, one small act at a time. I remember standing at the porch rail one dusk, the sky painted in fire and ash, and watching the lantern flicker dust in the barn. I could hear Aloe shifting hay, Nia humming soft as she settled the animals, and I felt a weight I hadn't noticed begin to lift. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to get through another day alone. I was thinking about how the place felt with them here, and it felt less like a refuge from the world, and more like the beginning of something I hadn't dared hope for. I didn't speak of it out loud, not then. Words weren't my way. But as I turned to step inside the cabin, I left the door open behind me a little longer than usual, letting the light spill across the porch, just in case they wanted to see it. The morning the fence gave way on the east pasture, I figured it would take me half the day to brace it. The rails had been sagging for weeks, but I hadn't gotten around to it, always telling myself there was time later. That morning, I walked out with a coil of rope and a hammer, thinking the job would be another chore I'd shoulder alone. But Aloe was already there, her braid hanging over one shoulder, a length of rope in her hand. She didn't ask if she could help, didn't wait for me to tell her what to do. She was already looping the line tight around the post. I stopped a few paces away, watching her work. Her movements were sure, practiced, nothing wasted. She pulled the rope taut and braced her weight against it, testing the strength. When she glanced back, her eyes met mine, and for once, she didn't look away. I set the mug of coffee I'd brought down on the rail beside. It'll hold better if you drive a new post in here, I said. Her hands stilled. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she looked back at the wood, then at me. Okay. One word, low and steady, but it landed heavy in the air. It was the first time she'd spoken to me since they'd come. I didn't let the weight of it show on my face. I just gave a short nod. I'll bring one from the pile after I finish feeding. She didn't answer, but she didn't turn away either. She just kept working the rope while I walked on. But all morning, that word echoed inside me. Okay. Simple as it was, it meant something had shifted. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It had cracked open enough to let one word pass between us, and I carried it like a mark. That afternoon, when I went back to finish the job, she was waiting, the hammer already in her hand. I held the post steady while she drove it in, each strike clean, no hesitation. The muscles in her arms tensed with each swing, and I thought about how many times she must have labored like this before, how many things she'd held together when no one else would. When the post was set, she stepped back, wiped her brow with her sleeve, and met my eyes again. No fear, no flinch, just steady. I realized then that trust doesn't always arrive with a smile. Sometimes it starts with a woman standing beside you, swinging a hammer without asking. Nia spoke to me a few days later. She'd been quieter than Aloe, her words locked deep, her hands always busy with the chickens or the dog. I came back from the ridge carrying firewood and found her sitting in the shade, a hen nestled in her lap. The dog lay beside her, his head on her skirt. I paused, setting the wood down, and asked, "You feeling better?" She lifted her eyes, soft but guarded, and nodded. "Yes." Another first word. It hung in the air as heavy as Aloe's had. I didn't push, didn't rush. I just leaned on the axe handle and said, "You've been around chickens before." Her lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile. "My grandfather raised them before." She trailed off, her eyes drifting, but she didn't finish. She didn't have to. I knew enough of what that word "before" carried. War, raids, men with ropes and trade in their eyes. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that she had offered me a piece of herself. A sliver, maybe, but it was more than silence. "You're good with them," I said, nodding toward the hen resting calm in her arms. "They follow you more than they follow me." She laughed then, the smallest sound, but real. It was quick, gone almost before it came, but it caught me off guard. I felt it like a crack of sunlight through storm clouds. I didn't tell her that, though. I just carried the wood inside, the sound of her laugh staying with me longer than I expected. The days that followed carried more of those small cracks in the silence. Aloe would pause longer when I spoke, sometimes answering with short, steady words. Nia began humming more, her voice low but sure, like she wasn't afraid the air might steal it away anymore. I didn't ask them to tell me their stories, didn't need to. I'd seen enough to know what had been taken from them. What mattered wasn't where they'd come from, but that they were choosing each day to stay. One night, I stepped onto the porch with my rifle across my lap, the stars sharp above the ridge. I could hear them in the cabin behind me, the faint sound of Nia humming while she swept, Aloe setting tools in order. I sat there, listening, and thought about how a man can live years without hearing certain sounds, only to realize he's been waiting for them all along. Trust didn't come in a flood. It came in one word at a time, in a hand brushing past mine when a tool was passed, in the weight of footsteps that no longer paused at the doorway but crossed it. I had thought silence was the only language left for me, but they were teaching me otherwise. And though none of us spoke it out loud, I knew we were all beginning to understand the same thing. We weren't just surviving side by side anymore. We were beginning to belong. The morning we rode into Broken Mesa together, the sun was already high and mean, beating down on the land like it meant to punish. Dust curled up beneath the mule's hooves, stinging my throat, settling heavy on my coat. I kept my jaw tight, eyes forward, every sense awake the way they'd been back in the war, when you knew you were walking into a place that didn't want you. Aloe walked beside me, steady as ever, her shoulders straight, each step carrying the weight of decision. Nia rode the mule sideways, her shawl pulled close, one hand shading her eyes from the glare. She looked small from the corner of my vision, but her silence wasn't weakness. It was a kind of defiance. I hadn't wanted to bring them into town. I could have gone alone, picked up supplies, and left them behind the safety of the ridge, but Nia had been the first to raise it. "Winter's coming," she'd said. "We'll need wool, salt, maybe boots." She was right, of course. I'd been planning for one man, not three, and I couldn't keep pretending the extra mouths didn't matter. They were part of my life now, whether I admitted it or not. When the rooftops of town came into view, I felt the same knot in my chest I used to feel before a gunfight. Not fear, exactly, more like readiness. I had left Broken Mesa once after Agua Fria, after the council turned its back on the weight of what we'd done. When I came back, I swore I'd keep my head down, keep my badge tucked where no one could see it. But walking in with Aloe and Nia beside me meant stepping into the fire. People notice what they don't understand, and they talk about it until the talking turns sharp. We passed the saloon first. A few men leaned back in their chairs on the porch, hats tipped, cards in hand. Their voices cut off as we came near, replaced by the scrape of boots against wood and the sound of eyes following. Further down, women sweeping porches paused mid-stroke, watching us without turning their heads. Nobody said anything, but the silence was louder than words. Inside the general store, the air smelled of dry grain and iron. A boy no older than 16 stood behind the counter, his face too young for the weight of the stares he gave us. His eyes kept darting to my revolver, then to Aloe, then back to me. I set the list down in my voice as flat as the land outside. Dried beans, flour, salt, hardtack, 3 yards wool, brown or gray, boots, sizes 5 and 6. He nodded too fast and disappeared into the back. Aloe moved to the shelves, her hands brushing over bolts of cloth until she stopped at one. "This one's thick," she said, holding it up. "Good for winter." I gave a short nod. "That'll do." She didn't wait for approval, just measured it with her eyes and folded it neat. Nia crouched near the bottom shelf, studying glass jars. She touched one gentle, almost reverent. "We could take 2, she whispered. I bent closer. "What for?" She lifted her eyes, steady and calm. "Jam. There are wild blackberries down by the creek. I saw them last week." It caught me off guard, that small vision of sweetness in a life that had seen little but hunger. I nodded. "All right, 2. We traded pelts and dried herbs to cover what coin couldn't. The boy packed the supplies in silence. I thought we might leave without trouble, but when we stepped outside, Councilman Pritchard was waiting, his arms folded, his smirk already planted on his face. He looked first at the sisters, his gaze sliding over them like he was still deciding their worth, then at me. "You're making a statement, Sheriff," he said. His voice carried enough to draw ears from the porch across the street. I met his eyes, my face still as stone. "I'm buying supplies." He tilted his head, lips twitching. "They still under your roof?" My jaw shifted, a muscle tight as a drawn bowstring. I could have said nothing, could have let his words hang in the air. But Aloe stepped closer, not behind me, but beside me, her chin lifted, her silence sharp as a blade. That small movement made my answer clear. "They live with me," I said. My voice was low, but it carried. "They work, they're free, that's all there is to it." The crowd shifted, a murmur rolling through the dust. Pritchard smirked again, but I saw the flash in his eyes, the irritation of a man whose grip had slipped. "Just make sure your arrangements stay civil." He tipped his hat with a motion that meant nothing, and walked off. We didn't speak as we left town, the mule heavy with supplies, but I felt the eyes on our backs until the rooftops fell away behind the ridge. The silence stretched all the way home. It wasn't until we reached the cabin that the weight finally loosened. Nia unpacked the goods, stacking flour and beans with quiet precision. Aloe laid the wool out on the bed, her hand lingering over the fabric like she was testing its warmth. I sat on the porch, staring at the horizon, the anger from Pritchard's words still turning in my gut. Aloe stepped out, her figure framed against the light. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "You worried about what they'll say?" I shook my head slowly. "No. You looked like you were." I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring out at the dry grass bending in the wind. "I'm not worried about talk. I'm worried some drunk might think it gives him permission." She nodded once, her face unreadable, but her voice steady. "We can handle ourselves." "I know," I said, turning my eyes toward her, "but I still keep watch." We sat in silence for a long while, the air cooling with the evening. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "We're not leaving, not now, not later. We've decided." I looked at her, the words cutting deep into me. She wasn't asking. She wasn't uncertain. It was a choice, plain and steady. I gave one small nod. "All right." And in that moment, the knot in my chest loosened. Whatever the town thought, whatever Pritchard smirked about, it didn't matter. They had chosen to stay, and I realized I wanted them to. The cabin had been built for one man. Every board I nailed, every crack I sealed, I did it with the thought of keeping just myself alive. The table was small, the hearth gave off enough heat for one body, and the silence inside those walls was thick enough to smother. I used to think that was safety, that if I kept things spare, then there'd be nothing to lose. But when Aloe and Nia began moving through that space, piece by piece, It stopped feeling like a hiding place and started to feel like something closer to living. It wasn't a loud change. There was no moment when they announced themselves. It came in small habits that became daily rhythms. I found myself laying 3 plates on the table instead of 1, 3 mugs on the porch rail in the morning. At first, they wouldn't cross the threshold when the food was ready. They'd linger outside, eating in the barn or by the fence, like they didn't want to disturb the order I'd kept, but the air began to shift. The cabin wasn't as still, wasn't as heavy. I'd hear the scrape of Aloe's chair as she mended by the fire, or the sound of Nia humming as she swept the floor. The silence became layered, no longer empty, but carrying the soft marks of other lives. One evening, I left the door open on purpose, the lamp casting its glow out onto the porch. I didn't ask, didn't call, just left it open. I was halfway through my meal when I heard light footsteps. Aloe came in first, her hair braided neat, her eyes calm but sharp as always. Nia followed, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze drifting over the room as though she was mapping every corner. They stood for a moment, not sure if they belonged, and I just tilted my head toward the chairs. "Sit," I said. They did. No one spoke much. The clink of forks on tin plates was the only sound for a while. I poured coffee, passed it across, and watched Nia take seconds when I set the pot down. Aloe didn't. She ate slow, measured, like she was weighing not the food but the meaning of the moment. When the meal was done, she stood and gathered the plates without asking. I moved to stop her. "You don't have to." She looked at me then, her voice even, almost stern. "I want to." I let her. Nia dried the dishes with an old cloth, moving quietly, her hands steady. I sat back in my chair, watching the two of them work in the same space I'd once guarded so fiercely. The basin had never held more than 1 pair of hands before, but seeing them there, side by side, the kitchen didn't feel crowded. It felt like something I'd been missing without knowing it. Afterward, I stepped out onto the porch while they lingered inside. The night air was cool, crickets stirring in the brush. I looked up at the stars, the kind of sharp, endless sky that makes a man remember how small he is. For years I'd sat there alone, rifle across my lap, listening to nothing but my own thoughts. That night, I could still hear them behind me, soft movement, a low hum of voices too quiet to catch. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like the silence was closing in. I felt like I was standing guard over something that mattered. As the days stretched on, their presence worked its way deeper into the bones of the place. Nia began humming more often, her voice carrying through the cabin as she stirred a pot or laid out herbs. Aloe cleaned the rifle one afternoon without being asked, her hands sure as if she'd done it 100 times before. She patched the quilt on my bed, tied off a loose hinge on the barn door. None of it was announced, none of it asked for. They simply tended to the things around them, and in doing so, they began tending to me. I noticed myself changing too. I no longer drank coffee alone on the porch at dawn. I'd wait, 2 mugs cooling beside me until Aloe or Nia stepped out of the barn. I no longer left the cabin in the evenings to give them space. I stayed inside when they swept, when they worked, when they moved quietly through the rooms. Their presence no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like the air filling a room that had been shut too long. One afternoon, I came in from the ridge, shoulders aching, boots caked with dust. Nia was waiting by the door with a bowl of stew in her hands. "I added wild onion," she said. Her voice was soft, but sure. I took it, breathed in the scent, and gave her a short nod. "Smells good." She didn't move right away. Her eyes lingered on mine, longer than they ever had before. There was no fear there, no hesitation, only something unspoken, like she wanted me to know she wasn't just passing through. Then she turned back toward the stove, humming under her breath. That evening, Aloe came to sit on the porch rail, the firelight from inside throwing her face into shadow. She didn't say anything at first, just sat, her eyes on the horizon. After a while, she spoke. "We're not here because we have to be. We're here because we choose to be." I looked at her, my chest tight with something I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to answer, but the words caught. Instead, I just gave a slow nod. That was enough for her. She leaned back, her silhouette steady against the night. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress built against the world. It felt like the beginning of a home. Not loud, not marked with declarations or promises, but with the quiet certainty that comes when people start moving in rhythm with one another. And though I didn't say it then, I knew I no longer wanted to imagine the place without them. It was Aloe who spoke first about choice. We'd been living in a rhythm so steady that days bled into one another. Chores done, meals shared, silence carried like an understanding. One evening, after we'd eaten, I stayed by the table with the oil lamp throwing soft light across the walls. Aloe lingered too, her hands resting flat on the wood, her eyes fixed on me. She didn't circle the subject, didn't ease her way in. She said it plain. We're not staying out of need. We're staying because we want to. The words hit me heavier than any blow I'd taken in the war. I leaned back, staring at her across that small table. I thought about the way I'd cut their ropes, the way they'd followed me out of town without a word, the weeks of silence, of fever, of work done without asking. I realized I'd been waiting for this moment, though I hadn't known it. Why? I asked, my voice low, steady, but inside me the question burned. Her gaze didn't waver. Because this place feels like something we've never had, not even before. You never touched us. You never gave us orders. You never tried to explain us to yourself. You just let us be. I sat with that a long moment, the lamp flame flickering between us. I had no answer, no words to give back, but she didn't seem to want one. She just needed me to hear it, and I did, more than I thought I could. Later that night, after she'd gone quiet, I sat by the hearth with my rifle across my knees. The fire snapped soft, and Nia came to stand behind me. Her hand rested on my shoulder for the first time. It wasn't long, just a touch, but I felt it sink through my coat into my bones. When I looked back at her, she spoke with a calm that startled me. When they gave us to you, I expected you to take us like they wanted. That's what men do. But you didn't. I swallowed, my jaw tight. I didn't take anything. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw the girl she must have been before the world stole so much. I know, she whispered. That's why we stayed. Then she walked away, leaving me staring into the fire, her words echoing like gunfire inside my chest. The days after that carried a different weight. Aloe began moving closer without hesitation. She still worked steady, still carried herself with that sharp composure, but when she handed me tools, her fingers brushed mine and didn't pull back right away. When she sat by the fire, she leaned against the wall with her eyes half closed, like she wasn't on guard anymore. Naya's humming grew louder, sometimes spilling into half songs I didn't know, and when I asked about them, she only smiled faintly and said, "Old songs." It was Aloe who crossed the line between silence and touch. One night, when the fire had burned low and the cabin lay quiet, she stood, walked over, and knelt beside my chair. Her eyes were steady, her voice low, but it carried like thunder in the still room. "I'm not offering because I owe you," she said. "I'm offering because I want to." For a long moment I didn't move. I just looked at her, the braid falling loose over her shoulder, the flicker of firelight across her face. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. Then I lifted my hand, touched her cheek gentle, and leaned in. Our lips met, not desperate, not rushed, just steady. It wasn't a kiss of comfort or debt, it was a choice. Her head rested against my chest afterward, her breath warm, her weight light but real. I held her close, one hand at her back, my own breath slow. I didn't ask for more. I didn't need to. That moment was enough. Not long after, the truth about Nia came out. She moved slower these days, her hands often drifting to her middle after bending down. I'd noticed, but I didn't press. One morning, Aloe spoke it plainly while Nia poured tea at the counter. "She's with child," she said, her voice firm, almost protective. I set my mug down, looked at Nia. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes meeting mine without apology. "How long?" I asked. "A few months," Aloe answered. "Before we met you. Back when—" She stopped, but she didn't need to finish. The silence carried the rest. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Do either of you need anything?" Naya blinked, surprised, not at the question, but at the way I asked it without judgment. She looked at me a long moment, then said softly, "Linen, and more willow bark for the pain." "All right," I said. "We'll ride in before the snow." Aloe's eyes stayed on me, measuring, but what she found there must have been enough. She eased, and I realized she had been waiting to see if I'd flinch, if I'd draw a line. But there was no line to draw. The child wasn't mine by blood, but it didn't matter. Blood wasn't what made a place safe. Choice did. That night, the fire burned bright, and I watched the two of them move through the cabin, the place I'd once built to keep the world out. Aloe's footsteps steady, Naya's voice humming low, and I knew then, as sure as I'd ever known anything, that they weren't staying because of what I'd given them. They were staying because they had chosen me, just as I had chosen them. And that choice, quiet and steady, was the truest thing I'd felt in years. I reckon some stories don't end the way a man expects. They don't finish with a slam of a door or the crack of a gun, but with the slow settling of dust after a storm, with silence that don't feel empty no more, but full. That's how it feels now, looking back on the miles behind me. I think of the man I was before, drifting, half dead in spirit, carrying the weight of things I never spoke aloud. And then I think of where I stand now, and the difference near breaks me. It's a strange thing when you realize the ache in your chest ain't just grief anymore. It's room. Room for something new to grow, room for someone else to belong. I never thought I'd find that again, not after the years I spent watching everything I loved fade into the dirt. But the Lord, or maybe just the stubborn will of life itself, had other plans. I sit on the porch most evenings, watching the lights slip down the horizon, and I catch myself whispering, "This is what home feels like." Funny, isn't it? All them years on the trail, all them nights by the fire under the stars, and not once did I feel settled. But here, with her laughter rising from the kitchen, with the sound of little feet running across the yard, with the smell of bread in the oven and wood smoke in the air, I feel anchored in a way that don't scare me. I used to be afraid of roots, thinking they'd only be torn out. Now I understand they're the only thing that keeps you from blowing away when the wind comes howling. There's lessons in that, ones I hold close. First, that no man's meant to shoulder his burdens alone. I carried mine until they near buried me, but when I opened the door to another's pain, when I let her grief touch mine, I found it didn't break me, it healed me. Second, that family ain't about blood, it's about choice. It's about who stays when the world tries to drive them off, about who looks you in the eye and says, "I ain't going anywhere," and means it. I've seen enough graves to know life's too short to waste on pretending we don't need each other. And third, that even the hardest past don't get to decide a man's future. We can take what tried to kill us and make it into something that keeps us alive. That's what we did. And that's what I'll keep doing as long as the Lord grants me breath. Sometimes, when the nights are quiet, I walk the fence line alone, lantern swinging in my hand, and I talk to the ones I lost. I tell them I'm all right now, that I kept going, that I found a reason worth waking for again. I like to believe they hear me. Maybe they do. But more than that, I know the woman beside me hears, and the little ones who now call me by name hear too, and that's enough. Their laughter fills the spaces grief once claimed. Their trust steadies my hands when I work. Their hope keeps me honest. I never asked for it, but I'd die before I let it go. There's a peace in choosing, not being forced. I've lived under orders, lived under loss, lived under fear. But this quiet, steady building of days, it's all choice. I choose to rise before dawn and split wood. I choose to sit at the table and pass the butter. I choose to stand beside her when the world looks down its nose and says we don't belong. And every choice I make says the same thing. I ain't leaving, I ain't giving up, I ain't letting the past be the last word. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: healing ain't a moment, it's a road. It don't come all at once, it don't come easy, but step by step it comes. And when you least expect it, you'll look around and realize you're not walking alone anymore. That's worth holding on to. That's worth fighting for. So if my voice carries anything tonight, I hope it carries hope. Hope that the broken can mend, that the lost can find, that the lonely can belong again. That's what happened to me. That's the truth I want you to remember when you close this story. Now, friends, if you've walked with me this far, I thank you. It means more than I can put in words. If you felt something in these pages, if you see a piece of your own journey in mine, I ask you kindly to like this video, leave a comment sharing what it stirred in you, and follow this channel so we can keep telling stories worth carrying. Your voice matters here, same as mine, same as anyone who's ever known what it is to lose, and then to find again. Life don't give us many second chances, but when it does, we best take them with both hands. I did, and I ain't letting go. That's the end of this chapter, maybe, but it ain't the end of the story. Not while breath still fills my lungs and the sun still rises over these wide, wild plains. This is Boon Laramie, and I'm grateful beyond measure for the hurt that shaped me, for the love that saved me, and for the chance to speak it plain so you might believe it too. That's my epilogue, but maybe, for you, it's just the beginning.